All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at the final, incredibly dense 24 hours of Jesus' life, and we're going to follow a strict chronological timeline here. Literally step by step, just as it's laid out in the source narrative, so we can really grasp how fast these events unfolded.
The whole 24-hour countdown, it's set into motion by this one striking question from Judas Iscariot. The text tells us he goes to the religious leaders who, by the way, are desperately looking for a way to quietly arrest Jesus away from the crowds. And he just agrees to betray his teacher. The price for this? Exactly 30 pieces of silver. That quiet little transaction is the fuse that lights this whole thing up.
Now, it's fascinating how this evening unfolds in this rapid, super emotionally charged succession. First, we start with this act of deep humility, Jesus actually washing his disciples' feet, showing them that to lead is to serve. But then the mood just sharply pivots to this incredibly tense revelation that there's a betrayer right there at the table, and it all wraps up with a highly symbolic final meal.
During this meal, Jesus totally redefines the traditional Passover. He takes the bread and a cup of wine and uses them to symbolize his own body and blood, instituting what he calls the New Covenant. He also uses this specific moment to tell his followers, hey, I'm leaving to prepare a place for you, but he promises an advocate is coming, the Spirit of truth, to guide them after he's gone.
And man, this brilliantly illustrates the heavy dramatic irony woven into the text. Just look at this stark contrast. On one side, you've got Peter making these vehement, emotional boasts of absolute loyalty. Even if I have to die with you, right? But answering that is Jesus' grim, super specific prediction of his closest friend's imminent failure. He tells him he's going to deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. It's the perfect setup for the psychological unraveling we're about to see.
Moving into the next phase, agony and arrest, specifically the midnight betrayal at Gethsemane.
As night fully sets in, the narrative moves the group out to the Mount of Olives, to a place called Gethsemane. And the text really highlights a moment of profound, crushing isolation here. Jesus is described as being so deeply distressed that his sweat is like drops of blood falling to the ground. He's repeatedly asking the Father to remove this bitter cup, but ultimately submits to his fate. And his closest friends? They're literally fast asleep nearby, failing to stay awake with him for even an hour.
So the actual arrest is captured in this incredibly jarring juxtaposition. You have this violent mob showing up, armed to the teeth with swords and clubs by the religious leaders, but who's leading them? A friend. And he's offering a traditional, affectionate greeting, a kiss. Jesus' response absolutely nails the bitter irony of it. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Things escalate rapidly from there. Peter actually pulls out a sword and severs a servant's ear, but Jesus instantly shuts the violence down. He plainly says that those who live by the sword die by it. He points out, I could effortlessly summon 12 battalions of angels right now, but I'm choosing to surrender to fulfill the scriptures. And seeing this absolute surrender, his terrified followers completely abandon him and flee into the night.
With Jesus under arrest, we hit our next section, trials and denials, taking us through the religious interrogations.
We see this build into a frantic legal shuffle right in the dead of night. Following the timeline, he's taken first to Annas, then over to Caiaphas the high priest, and finally brought before the full Sanhedrin at dawn. The text details how Jesus faces this barrage of false witnesses, but their stories just don't match up, which leads a deeply frustrated high priest to demand a direct, under-oath answer.
Here we get this masterful narrative split playing out at the exact same time. On the inside, Jesus is being beaten and condemned because he boldly affirms he is the Christ, the Son of Man. Meanwhile, just outside in the courtyard, Peter gets recognized by a servant girl, and he's terrified, cursing and swearing he doesn't even know Jesus, denying him 3 times, exactly as predicted. The text notes that when that rooster crows, Peter goes outside and just weeps bitterly. Right after this, the narrative does a brief cutaway to wrap up the tragic arc of the betrayer. Judas is consumed by intense remorse when he realizes he's condemned an innocent man, and he actually tries to return the 30 pieces of silver. But the priests, they coldly dismiss his guilt. So Judas throws the money into the sanctuary and goes to hang himself. The religious leaders then take that blood money and buy a cemetery for foreigners, forever known as the Field of Blood.
That brings us to the early morning hours and our next section, the Roman verdict, subtitled Shifting the Blame. Since the religious leaders don't actually have the legal authority to execute anyone under Roman occupation, they have to bring Jesus before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And notice the strategic pivot they make here.
To force Rome's hand, the accusers totally dropped the religious charges of blasphemy. Instead, they switched to highly political charges, subverting the nation, opposing taxes to Caesar, and claiming to be a king. I mean, these are direct threats to the empire.
What follows is essentially a desperate attempt by Pilate to pass the buck. First, he interrogates Jesus and openly states he finds no basis for a charge. Then, finding out Jesus is a Galilean, Pilate excitedly ships him off to King Herod's jurisdiction. But Herod is just hoping for a miracle, gets only silence, mocks Jesus, and sends him right back. Out of options, Pilate tries one final compromise. He says he'll have Jesus brutally flogged and then released.
But the crowd is absolutely not having it. There's a Passover tradition to release one prisoner, so Pilate gives them a choice. And look at the stark contrast here. On one side, an innocent teacher scourged and mocked with a crown of thorns. On the other, a literal murderous rebel named Barabbas. Stirred up by the religious leaders, the crowd loudly demands that Barabbas be freed and Jesus be crucified. Unable to stop this escalating riot and, importantly, ignoring a warning dream sent by his own wife, Pilate physically washes his hands right in front of the crowd. He symbolically declares himself innocent of Jesus' blood. The crowd vehemently accepts the responsibility, and Pilate finally caves, handing Jesus over for execution.
And now we enter the most brutal part of the timeline, the crucifixion at the place of the skull, or Golgotha.
The text maps out these agonizing 6 hours incredibly meticulously. At 9 a.m., a battered Jesus, who actually had to be helped by a man named Simon of Cyrene just to carry the cross, is nailed to it alongside 2 criminals. Pilate controversially insists on hanging a trilingual sign above him reading, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Then, by noon, the narrative describes this eerie, inexplicable darkness falling over the entire land, and it lasts straight through until 3 p.m.
Even while enduring excruciating pain and getting mocked by passersby and leaders telling him to, save himself, the narrative points out Jesus' astonishing focus on others. He uses his final breaths to ask God to forgive his executioners, to make sure his weeping mother is cared for, and, remarkably, to promise salvation to a dying repentant criminal hanging right there beside him.
Which leads us directly to the culmination of the narrative, death and burials, and how the earth itself reacts.
At 3 p.m, Jesus cries out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And finally, it is finished before giving up his spirit. According to the text, this triggers a massive chain of supernatural events. The huge veil inside the temple is violently torn in 2, straight from top to bottom. A severe earthquake literally splits the rocks, and tombs are shaken open. It's described as being so terrifying that a hardened Roman centurion standing guard is forced to confess, truly, this was the Son of God.
As evening falls on the day of preparation, the frantic 24-hour clock finally stops. To guarantee death without breaking his legs, which, again, fulfills ancient prophecy, a Roman soldier pierces Jesus' side with a spear. Then, a secret wealthy disciple named Joseph of Arimathea bravely asks Pilate for the body. He hastily but very respectfully wraps it in clean linen, places it in a brand new solid rock tomb, and rolls a massive stone over the entrance.
And that is exactly where we leave off at sunset. Just consider the final situation we're looking at here. You have a completely shattered movement, terrified disciples scattered and hiding, and a heavily sealed grave holding their executed leader. It really prompts the question, what could possibly happen next to turn this catastrophic, seemingly final defeat into a massive global movement? Well, we'll have to leave that for another explainer. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope this chronological breakdown made the narrative clearer than ever.